Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Cadet First Class Garrett Greenwood, and I will be your Master of Ceremonies and your moderator for today's panelist session. Our panelists today are Space Force leaders, Lieutenant General Deanna M. Burt, Mr. Chris Soley, and Chief Master Sergeant Jake Simmons. Lieutenant General Burt is the Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Operations, Cyber, and Nuclear, United States Space Force, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. As the Chief Operations Officer, Lieutenant General Burt has overall responsibility for operations, sustainment, cyber, and nuclear operations of the United States Space Force. Lieutenant General Burt entered the Air Force in 1991 as a distinguished graduate of the Air Force ROTC program at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Her career has included numerous satellite operations and staff positions in Air Force Space Command and U.S. European Command. The General has commanded the 2nd Space Operations Squadron, the 460th Operations Group, and the 50th Space Wing. She is a graduate and former instructor of the U.S. Air Force Weapons School and a graduate of the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. Prior to her current assignment, Lieutenant General Burt was the Commander, Combined Forces Space Component Command, U.S. Space Command, and Vice Commander, Space Operations Command, U.S. Space Force. Christopher A. Soley is a member of the Senior Executive Service and the Deputy Director of the Capability and Resource Integration Directorate, J8, United States Space Command, Peterson Space Force Base, Colorado. He is responsible for establishing the command's requirements and advocating for the assigned missions of deterring aggression and conflict, protecting and defending U.S. interests in the space domain, delivering space combat power for joint and combined forces, and developing ready and lethal joint warfighters. Chief Master Sergeant Jacob Simmons is the Senior Enlisted Leader for Space Operations Command at Peterson Space Force Base, Colorado. Space Operations Command is a field command of the United States Space Force, comprising thousands of space professionals and airmen worldwide. He advises the commander on matters influencing health, welfare, morale, and effective utilization of approximately 8,000 professionals responsible for providing space capabilities to the Department of Defense. Chief Simmons advises on mission effectiveness, professional development, and military readiness and training of all assigned and attached space forces, enabling the preparation, generation, and sustainment of combat-ready space, cyber, and intelligence and combat power forces. Before we begin, I would like to add that the views presented are those of the panelists and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or its components. So now we're going to transition into the moderated portion of today's session. One time again, I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of everyone here for taking your time to come speak with us today. I think we're all really excited to hear what you have to say. So, yes, thank you.
I'm glad y'all got that out of the way now. You may want to rethink that removal.
All right, General Burt, first question. The CSO has highlighted Mission Command as an essential component of the Space Force's success. How can leaders create conditions for Mission Command to be successful?
So if you guys, first I'd like to identify, would all the guardians in the room please stand up for me? And that's if you're going to be a guardian and you know you're going, hey, look, a couple more. Let's give them a round of applause. So the reason I asked them to stand up, one was just to recognize that, again, we're in the Department of the Air Force. You have the Air Force and the Space Force working shoulder to shoulder every day, even here at your United States Air and Space Force Academy, as we like to say. We like those Space Force uniforms too, right, Chief, that they wore last year? But what I would say is when we talk about Mission Command, every one of the guardians that you saw stand are empowered to do their job here at the Academy. Small but mighty, and have to get the job done. So what Mission Command says for me as a commander, that I'm going to give the left and right limits, the guidelines, my intent, and what I need us to accomplish as a team. I do not give the how. The how is determined at the lowest level as empowered, and they go out and find the most innovative, efficient, lethal way to get after the job. And that's what we want our guardians doing at the lowest levels. We've eliminated layers of command. We don't have group commands. We don't have numbered air forces as we set up the Space Force. Why? Because it's the digital age. We wanted to be able to flatten the organization and to empower the lowest level. So mission command is critical in the Space Force of how we designed it from the ground up. The second piece why I would say mission command is important and why all of you here at the Academy, even in the Air Force, that it's important to you is the way we're going to go to war with potential adversaries like China, where we will be denied and it will be a difficult fight going in from a distance at an away game. How are you going to continue to fight through when you're losing comms or you don't have the things you need? How are you going to be on mission orders and continue to prosecute when you lose comms with parts of your element or back to a C2 element? That is going to be critical for us to fight and win if we have to go and fight a war in Indo-PACOM. So those are reasons why I think mission command is important and understanding how to empower folks to get the best out of them and to get the most innovative ideas that we can.
Yes, ma'am, that message of almost decentralized command in a sense, trying to bring that approval authority down and give our lower leaders, cadets about to graduate, that ability to actually command and lead. That's amazing. Chief Simmons, how would you characterize the value the Space Force places on psychological safety at the tactical unit and risk tolerance at the highest leadership echelon?
So like General Burt said, I really appreciate you all being here. And I know you had a menu of options of things that you could be doing, and you decided to come and join us. Actually, they said it was open seating. This seat was open. I just took it. I don't know that I was actually invited to sit here. They said, here, give me your bio and you can stay up at the front. So I took the opportunity. When we talk about psychological safety, and it's great that you segued it from mission command. You can't have mission command unless you have psychological safety. You have to have an environment where you feel comfortable expressing your views, ideas, your innovations. You have to be surrounded by a support system, a team that values your contribution. And so mission command just doesn't work without psychological safety. The way I would sort of couch it is onus. That's our Space Force, I believe, approach to mission command and to psychological safety. And if you look at the word onus, O-N-U-S, it's on us. We understand that there is an urgent ownership about what we do. Every single Guardian, every single mission, it's on us. It's our onus. The Navy calls it TACMO. Take charge and move out. And I think that is what our Guardians are, hungry to do. Give me the opportunity to take charge and move out at echelon, where I can be empowered to engage and to execute and not have to ask to continue acting at echelon. And that requires competency, that requires trust, and trust in our talent more than in our tools. If you think about it, the tools that we are given have an expiration date. They have a limited lifespan. They are actually designed knowing that they're going to fail. Our tools just don't last forever, whether it's a satellite, whether it's a radar, whether it's a rocket. It doesn't matter. Those things are going to fail, and we expect them to. And we're given those tools with that condition. This is good for this long. Our trust in our Guardians and in our airmen cannot have a limited lifespan. That has to be enduring. And mission command, psychological safety, it takes advantage of us trusting and having an unlimited lifespan in the trust of our Guardians and in our airmen, that they're going to make the right decisions, and when they make a decision that needs to be adjusted, that they're going to take ownership of that as well.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, that trust is definitely a two-way street with followers knowing that they have the trust of their leaders to be able to lead themselves. So that's super insightful. Mr. Soley, how do you handle getting bad news from your subordinates, and how do you deliver bad news to your superiors?
So I'll say in general, bad news usually doesn't age well with time. You've probably heard that before. The approach that I try to take with my people is I want them to feel like they can always come to me and talk to me, good, bad, or ugly. And so I try, not always successfully, but I try to not react negatively to the initial of bad news, and then try and understand, okay, why, what was the reasons why maybe the bad news happened, depending on what the circumstances is, and then getting a grasp for what the bad news is, potentially if there is a way to resolve it or to move forward, to move around it, that sort of thing, and then being able to figure out how to deliver that to my leadership. And then usually after the fact, I'll want to circle back up with my team and say, okay, this happened. It didn't go the way we wanted it to. What can we do differently in the future to try and make it not happen again? I think in terms of then delivering that to my seniors, depending on the situation and the circumstances, I work in the 8, so typically bad news in my world means, oh, maybe we didn't get some money that we were hoping to get. Maybe we didn't get approval on a document through the joint requirements process that we wanted. So it typically is not life impacting. So it's usually not all that bad in terms of catastrophic would be, in my mind, losing a life. And so again, depending on the level of severity, I prefer to do it in person if possible, but usually as soon as possible. A specific example I would give is over the Christmas holidays, we typically go into kind of a minimum manning status and that sort of thing. But I was made aware pretty much at the end of the business day that I had one of my military members, and so I work at Space Command, so I have a joint command. It's Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force. I don't have any Marines that work for me. There are Marines at the command. But I was made aware of a military member who was contemplating suicide. And obviously that's not good news. And I was literally on my way out the door to go home for the day. And I was like, nope, I can't go home. I got to figure out, okay, where's this guy now? Who can we get to go and talk to him, be with him, and that sort of thing. And so we spent an hour and a half, 2 hours of reaching out to him, reaching out to people that knew him. He was only been in my organization for a week. So I hadn't even had my normal kind of in-doc welcome greeting to my organization. But we were able to get 2 people that worked for me that knew him and worked with him to go and get time with him and that sort of thing. And we were able to engage with, his service element leadership as well, make them aware. And so the good news is he is in a much better state today and getting the help that he needs to deal with the situations that he's going through. To that end, I attempted to call the chief of staff of the command before I left that day. He was unavailable. I talked to his deputy, kind of verbally gave him an update, and then I sent out an email update again, because that's something I could have chose to wait on that bad information. And if things had gone the opposite direction, it would have been probably much more challenging for me than to have to go to my leadership and say, hey, I knew about this. We were taking action. I chose not to tell you. And I think that would have been bad. So.
If I may, I want to connect that. These 3 questions are pretty important together, right? It's not each of these individually. So first we talked about mission command, then we talked about psychological safety, and then we talk, how does your boss respond to people below them, and how do they communicate up? All those are connected, right? So the leader has to model the behavior and have the trust to push the mission command down and know that when we push the command down and empower the lowest level, mistakes are going to happen, things are going to go wrong, and how do you then make yourself available and hear and not react in a way that doesn't then squelch continuing to go out and take initiative and lead? And then also, how do you provide the top cover and continue to provide up channel to the highest levels? We all have to be psychologically safe to be able to communicate that way and have the courage to talk about that, one of our core values. We have to have connectedness, that we're able to talk to each other, and the character to keep trying to do the right things. So I think it's important that those three things are all linked together. We talked about them individually, but I hope people recognize that culturally, that's all of those things we're trying to bring together in the Space Force in reality to execute.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that, sir. Thank you for sharing your insight. And I think the approachability from a leadership perspective is just crucial in, bad news only getting worse with time. If your people are able to come to you quickly about something, you can handle it as fast as possible. So, General Burt, shifting gears here, as an intentionally designed lean and agile force, how does the Space Force ensure the health of its force and prevent burnout while simultaneously moving fast to deliver force capabilities in support of military objectives?
So this is a good question, because we talk a lot about, for the Guardians, and many of them can tell you for the last 3 years, we've all been sprinting pretty hard to stand up a service. And so we always talk about it's a marathon, not a sprint, and we're trying to pace ourselves as we do this, because there's a lot of work to be done. And doing it with a zero-sum game or minimal resources, doing it with what you have, requires a couple things. And I think to keep burnout from happening, one is making sure, first and foremost, we're taking care of folks at the human level. Do we understand the situations with each of them, their families, what's going on in their lives, and how are we keeping track of them as the human weapon system? How are we working with them individually as commanders? Second would be also, how am I viciously prioritizing? So I have to know, as the leader of an organization, what's most important to us and what are we going to do in a given time frame. We only have so many resources. Where's the cut line? What are we going to accept risk and not do? And then what are we absolutely not going to let go of? That has to be done at every level, from the lowest level who's been empowered all the way to the top, to ensure that we're putting resources where it's most important. And every Guardian matters, and so every one of you are very important. I can't put you somewhere that you're not going to be gainfully employed. So talent management and putting people in places where they're going to be successful, and giving them the development they need to avoid burnout, because we prepared them for that job. They're in that job. We've given them priorities. They're able to execute and move out, and we're taking care of them and their family to ensure that they have what they need. Those are all the things I think we have to do across the Department of Defense. And the Secretary of Defense just published a memo that talked about how we're going to take care of the overall force, and talked about many of those things. Spousal employment, how do we ensure that happens? How are we working with childcare and being able to take care of families? And then making sure, again, we're talking about readiness and the resources that we have, and making honest decisions as leaders about what our priorities are. So from the Department of Defense on down to how I do that every day in the U.S. Space Force, I think are critical to ensure we don't have burnout. Chief, anything you guys?
So as you said, there's the people part, there's the prioritization part, and then I think that this is where our partnering to win really, really comes into play. If you look at the Space Force, we leverage the Air Force for all of our power projection, every last ounce of it. We cannot begin to do our mission until our airmen show up to work and do theirs. I think we also have to look at how do we levy against our allies, our industry, our academia, the joint partners. All of that's got to come into play specifically because of our size. We have to be humble enough to approach all of these partners and say, I need what you have and I need you to do it for us. And that's going to be our force multiplier.
Thank you both. And I think it's important, and I'm glad that the two of you are thinking about the human weapon system as you described. Like, oftentimes we don't think about that, and we just think about the kinetic weapon, and there's humans behind all of that. So that's super important. Chief Simmons, the Space Force is an equal partner in the joint fight. How does the Guardian ideal help to amplify a space professional's spirit as a warrior in the profession of arms?
So hopefully everyone in here is tracking the Guardian Ideal. We had two major documents that were released as the Space Force was established. One was the Space Power Capstone, and that really talked about what it is that we do. And then we had the Guardian Ideal, which really talked about who we are. I will tell you that those two viewpoints are not competing. They're not opposing viewpoints. The piece that talks about who we are as guardians and the piece that talks about who we are or how we do our space warfighting as a business. We have to understand first and foremost, and at the end, our why. Space has become the critical infrastructure for all the other critical infrastructures. If space isn't there, everything else falls apart. The rest of the joint fight slows to a crawl. And we understand that that's a role that we have to show up each and every day to perform. General Saltzman actually said that we're in a race to build combat credibility before we're put to the test. And the emphasis is on the before. And the reason why that matters is all the other services were actually built in battle. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, we didn't just have those just to have them. We had them because we needed them. The Space Force is unique in that it's being created for what might come. And that is a different set of challenges for us to understand when we're thinking through our Guardian ideal. Our Guardian commitment is the environment that helps to establish a 21st century warfighting team. I believe that we're emphasizing who we are as Guardians, what we have to do differently, and most importantly, why it matters. That is all part of our Guardian ideal. That is all part of our warfighting spirit. Our Guardian ideal gives us an opportunity to understand how do we take care of our people, but that warfighting mindset is how do we take care of our business. Those two pieces, the Guardian has to be able to meld together seamlessly. They have to be able to do both. And when you pull those both together, that really gives us what I would consider our ethos, being able to take care of our people, being able to take care of our business.
Thank you, sir. And you touched on just how unique the Space Force is and that it's the first service kind of created for what might come. And those challenges, we've started to see some of them, but I don't know that a lot of people actually think about the fact that we haven't truly been able to test what the Space Force is intended to do when we do see combat. So it's very important. Mr. Soley, how do you handle updating superiors when you have found that you have given them incorrect or inaccurate information?
So again, in my world, having a good network and getting information is really key to try and position yourself well to make the arguments to the right levels to hopefully get decisions to go in your way. Sometimes that leads to getting bad information or you get information that was maybe decided at one level, but then it gets to the next higher level of leadership and they change their minds. And so typically, as I find out if I've given bad or inaccurate information, I like to deliver that person again in person from me, and that I take ownership, even if it was maybe something my team gave me incorrectly. I take the fall for the information that I gave to my boss, and I will take ownership of that every single time, because I don't want my people to lose or be afraid of coming to me with information. I would rather have information, multiple information, maybe conflicting information, and be able to sort it out. So an example of that recently was we're wrapping up the throes of finishing up the fiscal year 24 DoD budget. And there's a document that is released by an organization called CAPE. It's called a PIDM, a Program Decision Memorandum. And there was a Program Decision Memorandum 1 that came out in late November, early December timeframe. And there were a couple decisions in that Secretary Kendall didn't agree with. And I think we were, General Dickinson was aligned with the Secretary's decision on, hey, we wanted to push back on try and make a change. And even the Indo-PACOM commander wanted to push back and try and make a change. And everything that I was told from my network was that both the Indo-PACOM commander and the Secretary of the Air Force were going to do what's called a reclama to the PIDM, back to the Secretary of Defense and requesting that something gets changed. And so based on that, General Dickinson then was also going to submit a reclama. 12 hours later, we found out that Secretary Kendall had decided not to do a reclama on this specific item. And we also found out that Admiral Aquilino at INDOPACOM had also decided not to reclama on this specific item. So I had to go back and tell General Dickinson, this is what's happening. We can either choose to reclama, or it might be better that we save face. We'll wait. There's going to be a second. We knew there was going to be a second PITM coming out, so we could save face and not reclama, and that was ultimately the decision he had to do. But again, initially, the information we provided him was, hey, we think there's going to be 2 other organizations. If we chime in, we think we'll be successful in getting this changed. And then again, over time that changed, and had to go back and tell him. He understood and appreciate. I think my experience has been leaders appreciate when you're honest and open with them, and when you take ownership for your mistakes.
Sir, tying back in with the idea of psychological safety as well, having that ownership at that upper level creates that culture of psychological safety, because the ability to come to you with maybe inaccurate information, now you have that freedom and ability. So thank you. General Burt, the Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, characterized 2023 as the year of readiness for the Space Force, and he is focused on transitioning from establishing an independent service to delivering force capabilities to the Joint Force. What were some of the leadership challenges faced up to this point, and what are some lessons learned that leaders can apply towards achieving the CSO's lines of effort?
Great question. So we're in our 3rd year, so a lot going on. Readiness is now where General Saltzman wants to go, because we've spent the last 3 years really building the service. So think standing up U.S. Space Command in August of 2019, and then 4 short months later, we stood up U.S. Space Force in December of 2019, with the same commander, by the way, dual-hatted, General Raymond. And General Raymond was dual-hatted all the way up until August of the next year, before General Dickinson was named as the commander of U.S. Space Command. So what that did was we were taking a lot of risk with what was Air Force Space Command to stand up U.S. Space Command. And then 4 months later, we said, no, we need all those resources back, because now we're going to stand up a service. We also went through a lot of political change, right? There was a presidential election and change a year later after we stood the Space Force up. We changed out Congress. We did again just recently, had a change in the power structure in the government. So again, when different parties take lead, how does that affect how the department is funded? How do they view space and the threat? How do we educate now that Congress has changed over and the political leadership? So all of those things come into play. We've talked about the guardian ideal. How do we set up the structure? I'm sure Chief and I have learned more about how to create songs, patches, what we're going to call people in the Space Force are now guardians, Semper Supra. I mean, all of the things that are culturally defining the service, we've spent 3 years doing. We're really close to wear testing this summer, the new uniform. We're talking about wearables for PT tests rather than doing the standard PT test. I mean, just a lot of change of standing up a service. No one would ever have thought how interesting and exciting that is, but you'll hear General Saltzman often say, we come into work really excited every day, and we go home to bed at night and lay our heads on the pillow with either a headache or just absolutely exhausted from all the things that we're trying to work every day to stand up the service. So we've stood it up. So now it's to get to delivering capabilities. So that's about readiness, and how do we provide the most combat-ready lethal force we can in defense of the Constitution of the United States and on behalf of the Joint Force. Because the Joint Force, as we've talked about, needs those space capabilities to execute as they would day in, day out. And we also need to be able to deny the enemy the use of space against the Joint Force. So how are we going to do that moving forward? Things we've learned. I think it's really important to communicate. When you're going through change, things are changing very rapidly, and how are we communicating to the lowest level, especially when we talked about mission command? If I'm going to empower you to the lowest level, you have to know where we are and the changes that are being made top to bottom, and there has to be kind of a flat communications and transparency. And so that we found that's hard because things have been moving so fast. So being able to communicate, and I'm sure the Guardians who are stationed here at the Academy, even though they're right next door to quite a bit of space capability here in Colorado Springs, probably sometimes do feel disconnected about how things are changing, that you're not always getting the latest. So that's been the real lesson learned, is how do we communicate? And not only within the service, but external to our joint partners and our international partners and where we're going and what we're trying to do structurally, but also to the American people, the taxpayer. There was a lot of confusion, and I think there are still in some parties, in even Colorado, there are of what is U.S. Space Command versus what is the United States Space Force, because they stood up so close together. United States Space Command is a combatant command. And they are to take the fight at 100 kilometers to infinity and run the domain and fight the fight and have the war plans to do that. The United States Space Force is a service that organizes, trains, and equips and prepares the capabilities that are presented to U.S. Space Command and the other combatant commanders to execute the fights in their theaters. So those key differences, because both started in Colorado Springs, because General Raymond was dual-hatted as both, until we got the service out to DC, because all services are in the Pentagon near Congress to do all the discussions about money and resourcing. So until we got that distance of separation geographically, there was a lot of confusion even here. For the Guardians of the Room, I am literally, when I travel, a walking billboard that says United States Space Force. I have all my Space Force gear on, and I know Chief does too when we go out. I'm not going to tell you how many times people will say, "Hey, what do you do?" "Oh, I'm in the military." "Yeah, what service?" "Oh, that's real." And so then I go into a discussion of, yes, it's real, and it's not just a Netflix show. But that's important. So what that, I make fun of that, but what that means to you with communication is we have to communicate to the people we serve, and that's the U.S. taxpayer and our country. And so we have to do a better job of communicating. The second big lesson learned, I think, is, again, that relationship with U.S. Space Command and a service, establishing both as they've grown. Again, U.S. Space Command existed previously. Many of you are way too young to know that, but Chief and I both served and had U.S. Space Command when we were youngsters, and after 9/11, we stood down U.S. Space Command because there was a law that said there could only be so many combatant commands. So we stood up NORAD/NORTHCOM to defend the homeland and stood down U.S. Space Command and put it under Strategic Command. And ever since we did that, we have been trying to bring it back. You guys may not know that the Space Force was talked about in 2001 in the Rumsfeld report, and it came out in the summer, and then September 11th happened, and all of that went to the wayside, as it should, because the nation was focused on threats to the homeland. So both of these things are not things that didn't exist before, or we didn't understand the importance of, or that we thought we needed. It was what was happening in time and space in the world, and when was the right time to do these things. When you stand the combatant command up first, we started with a functional look like Special Operations Command or Transportation Command. But 4 months later, when we stood up a service, and then we also gave U.S. Space Command an area of responsibility, which is 100 kilometers to infinity. So they have an AOR, an area of responsibility, just like any other geographic combatant commander. So now when you have a geographic combatant command and a service, that changes the dialogue. And so we've had to normalize with the joint staff and with our international partners about how do you what responsibilities does a COCOM do? What responsibilities does a service do? So that's been key now as we talk about delivering capability to the Joint Force. How do we normalize the relationship between the two and be complementary to each other? We absolutely have to work together as a team, but grow and mature together. And then that last point I would say is, in order to get after delivery, we have to get rid of the other distractions. Okay, we've got a uniform, we've got a slogan, we've got a song, good, done. Let's hold for those, and now let's drive on delivering mission. And if those need to be iterated somewhere down the road, they will, but we have to viciously prioritize now, focusing on mission delivery and execution. So those are the kinds of things that we've learned, and I think where General Saltzman is taking us, and as you guys see him in the next session, with Chief Toberman, you're going to hear a lot of that again. But absolutely, how do we, his first line of effort is combat ready forces, and that's where we're headed here over his tenure in the next 4 years.
So just to amplify, if you think about it, the Space Force has gone from being an idea to being introduced to being fully integrated in 3 years as a service. If you were to ask anybody 4 years ago if there would actually be a Space Force, it was still an improbability. It was a iffy, you could roll the dice. If you were to ask them that same time, there will be a Space Force and this is what it will do in the next 3 years, it would have gone from an improbability to an impossibility. There's no way you're going to be able to build a service, stand it up from scratch in 3 years. And oh, by the way, a combatant command as well. That is just an impossibility. So lesson number one is never underestimate what people can do. We learned that if there was an insatiable hunger, there was a living thread out there that was thinking about how to get after our lifestyle, that we would step up as a department and we would get it done. I think another thing that you had keyed on, ma'am, that we really learned was that there is a domain change, right? We learned that we are no longer in a benign world and that we had to get ready for a battle-capable environment. And those lessons had to be transcribed into all of the organizational structure. And it wasn't just the uniforms and the songs, it was the standing up of squadrons, it was the how to present capabilities into combatant commands. It was bringing on systems from other services so that we could collect all of the satellite communications under one enterprise. It was how do we best situate ourselves for the joint fight among our joint partners. I think there was a ton of things that we learned, but now the question is, with the momentum, what will we learn 3 years from now? What will we learn in 6 years? If we keep extrapolating, multiplying that out, where will we be? I think that you are going to see some incredible things over the next 3 and 6 years out of your Space Force.
Yeah, thank you both. And I think to kind of put those two together, we're about to see what the Space Force was really intended to do and what this service is, what it was made for. And that's really exciting moving forward in the near future. Chief Simmons, how will the Space Force's concentration on creating competencies yield Guardians more suited to meet evolving adversarial threats?
So just continuing on with what we're just talking about, the things that we thought about today, yesterday, we are light years ahead of what we thought we'd be yesterday. Where we'll be tomorrow, still inconceivable. We don't know what's coming. It's very hard to project given the rate of technology growth, of capabilities stacking on top of capabilities on top of capabilities, and what that means to a thinking adversary and how they might apply their motives to that. We have unmanned artificial intelligence, machine learning, nuclear fusion, hypersonics, low observables, transforming and satellites that can reach out and touch, right? We are altering the paths of asteroids. This is stuff that we grew up watching in movies. This was sci-fi. For you, it's sci-fact. This is just the way things are. But we saw these things as unreal. And we are living in what we saw as our future. And so that's incredible. Now, how does that tie into competencies? We have to have a fix on the types of experiences and exposures and expertise our Guardians must have, not based on what we grew up dealing with, but what they will be dealing with, what is to come. Our greatest advantage, our greatest accelerators by far are our people. It's not the tools, it's not the weapon systems, it's our people. I believe that we have seen, and we're starting to see, a concerted shift towards being steeped in expertise. In a benign world, you could dabble. You could try things out. And you could do that for a career. Because to be quite frank, the opponent on the other side of the line was so much smaller, slower, weaker, had so little to come against you with, that we could just overwhelm them with brute strength. And that's changed. And so now we need to have experts that can go toe-to-toe with another expert. Somebody that has been built to take down our advantage in any one of our space disciplines. And that's crucial as we go about doing our talent management. It has to be tailored, and it has to be thoughtful, but it has to reach the end of being able to field a combat-ready guardian to specifically go after and achieve an objective. That is something that we can no longer overlook. We can no longer dabble. We have to be practitioners. I think that as we go through each of our competencies, what it will do is it'll allow us to understand which prerequisites are necessary for any type of opportunity, so we can align the right person with the right experiences to that opportunity. But then it'll also allow us to understand what return on investment we get from a person that has had an opportunity, so that we can build on it and we can send them forward for those jobs that need that set of new prerequisites, new experiences. Because we're going to continue to be challenged in what our guardians are going to have to bring to the table. Each of those experiences have to be building blocks for the expertise that we need to be able to field to be combat-ready forces.
Yes, sir. I think that touches a bit on maybe the business side of space and the Space Force, and how maximizing return on investment, getting the most out of the guardians, our guardians that we can, super important to the overall success of the service. So, our last question in the moderated portion of the session, Mr. Soley, can you describe the role that the Space Force and the Air Force have in national security as part of the Department of the Air Force?
Yeah, so General Burt and I talked about this. We're going to tag team this one. I'm going to take you back in history a little bit to August of 18. Lieutenant General Harris, the Air Force A8 at the time, walked into my skiff unannounced and said, about 10 o'clock in the morning, he said, "Hey, Chris, at 4 o'clock today, we're going to go see Secretary Wilson. And you're going to have 4 different proposals ranging from standing up a Department of Space to a Space Force and everything in between. You need to include a combatant command. You need to include all the acquisition. You need to know how many additional people we need, how much additional money we need." Kind of an easy task to get done in 4 hours. So that afternoon started a journey that lasted for me for about 9 months, up until I got paroled and got to go to National War College. But involved with Secretary Wilson, with a lot of the OSD offices, and then ultimately going over and being part of the briefing team to the Hill to try and get Space Force created. And I think what we did, the concept of what we came up with was really I'll say a Marine Corps-like model. So for those of you who don't know, the Marine Corps is part of the Department of the Navy. And part of that is we knew even back then, and probably more so now, the fiscal environment, right, is very challenging. And so we couldn't afford to spend a whole bunch of money on overhead or standing up. The headquarters of each of the services of the departments, I'll say, in the Pentagon are several thousands of people and millions of dollars to do that. So to recreate that for the Space Force was going to be very, very hard. And so the decision was made to not do that, and instead to try and make it a lean service as part of the Department of the Air Force and leverage where we could. And actually the law now says this, right? So we didn't stand up a FM function, right? So we have SAF FM that takes care of all of the execution of funds for the Department of the Air Force. We didn't send up a separate FM function for the Space Force or Legislative Affairs or General Counsel or all of those functions that happen across the Secretariat of the Air Force staff. And so by doing that, we're able to have a Space Force that is lean and agile, really focused on delivering combat capabilities to primarily U.S. Space Command, but to all of the combatant commands to support the joint fight. And so what you have now is you have two services within one department that is not unusual. Again, just like the Department of the Navy has been doing it for literally hundreds of years. And you're delivering capabilities both from air and from space that are critical and a key piece to virtually every O plan that's out there for every single combatant command to be able to support our national interests and national security strategy.
So while he was in the Pentagon, I was here in Colorado Springs working with General Raymond on the staff, and so got to see from the ground floor how that executed here as we stood up the service. Yes, we went to the Marine Corps model and we all understood that Department of the Navy model, but what I would posit is that works, and our partners in the Air Force are absolutely critical to what we do. And as you heard Chief Simmons say, we depend on our airmen every day at our installations to provide all of that base operating support that we need. And it is our fighting platform because our missions are 365, 24 hours a day, 365 from the installation we fight from. Power, HVAC, or our tanker gas. I cannot do my job without the installation for about 85% of our mission set. So with that said, I mean, again, that's a critical partnership there. There's the physicality of where does air end and where does space begin, and we've defined that at 100 kilometers. You just saw the Chinese with a balloon test that gray space between air and space, and where does it begin? So it's good that we are in the same department and having those same kinds of discussions. What I would ask this room is, do you believe the Space Force mission, like the Marine Corps mission, is contained and is not growing? I would argue it is growing and it will grow rapidly. So the model may or may not work. How long does it hold? What would be the triggers? And that will be for many of you in here to decide in your career timelines as you are sitting in these seats for the future. And again, it's not because our Air Force team is a bad partner or being part of the Department of the Air Force. We're not making good decisions or getting things done. We are. But the enemy is voting every day. You saw the balloon. You saw the Russians blow a satellite into thousands of pieces a little over a year ago. They are continuing to vote and continuing to build capability. Therefore, we will be building and growing with them in order to be able to defend against that. They are near peer competitors and gaining on us. So how are we going to address that? And there's going to have to be growth. And General Saltzman did a lot of that discussion in his testimony about deterrence and accountability and how do you create norms of behavior. Those are all very important. But once someone breaks that norm of behavior, how are you attributing that, holding them accountable, and then responding with the full force of the military capabilities or the dime or information or economic power that we have as a nation. But the military element of space is going to continue to grow. So I also want to posit, we're going to go to the moon and stay. Who else is? Yes, a round of applause. We're going to go to the moon and stay. But who else is? The Chinese. So now there will be key lines of communication going to the moon. So we talk about the Lagrange points, and that's a point between the Earth and the moon, between the gravitational pull of the two bodies is kind of a stable place. To have gas at geosynchronous orbit and in is a nice to have. Gas going to the moon is required. So you're going to have supplies, gas, things. These Lagrange points are going to become critical lines of communication. Who owns them? Who has them? Is it a first come, first serve? We're going to go to the south pole of the moon. Why? Because that's where there's water. And we think life is sustainable there. We also think that around, and I'm saying we as in NASA, the whole US, we about space, around it is a ridge of great minerals and chemicals and things that are only found in trace on the Earth's surface. So what do you think when I find the magical mineral chemical that's worth billions of dollars? Sounds like the Wild Wild West in gold, doesn't it? And what happened when those gold claims were stood up and they started fighting and attacking each other? What happened? You started building forts and you brought the military in to protect those folks. Again, I don't want that to be the case. I don't want there to be a war in space. I don't want to fight. But that's what my job is, and why I put this uniform on every day, is to be prepared to on behalf of my nation if called to. And so I think we have to think about it. We talk about going to Mars. Mr. Musk is on the path. He is going to get there. So that's a whole nother planetary discussion. So again, for the young cadets in this room, I challenge you to think about, when you go back in your rooms and you're talking, what does the DoD look like if I'm now with forces on the moon, forces on Mars, and beyond? Are we still Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard, the Space Force? Or are we something more purple? I had someone ask me the other day about all the transfers we're doing from the other services. And by the way, we're all inter-service transfers, because like Chief and I, we came from the Air Force. So we're all inter-service transfers to the Space Force. But when you say you're taking all the Army guys, no, I'm not. I'm taking the guys who want to do space work or who are doing space in the Army to the Space Force. But if we go to the moon and stay, who knows how to own real estate? That's not a Space Force person. That's an Army person. And so do you look at your force structure differently once you start populating different places that are not Earth? So when I usually say that, I say we get to Star Trek looking options. So some of you are way too young and may have never watched Star Trek in your life. But we start talking about, I am a Sector 13 force, and I am this planet force, and I do these things. Well, it sounds, again, it's just like watching the Jetsons. We thought that was the future, and man, the Jetsons have come to life for a lot of things we see today, robots and Zoom and all the things we watched on the Jetsons are actually reality today. But that's the things to think about. That is becoming a reality when we go to other places and stay. That will be your generation, cadets. That's who I'm talking to directly. That will be your generation, and it will be very exciting. We want to do that in a way that's free and fair for all, that's prosperous for our industry and our partners, and we go there together. But if asked to fight and called upon, we are ready to defend our nation and our people who are out there doing that exploration.
So speaking of China, what are they thinking about space? We talk about the first island chain, we talk about Taiwan, we talk about the moon, right? What are their motives? What are their intents? How much time are you spending, future Airmen Guardians, reading their dossier? How much time are you spending looking at their TTPs, their tactics, their capabilities, their competencies, their culturisms? How much time are we spending understanding our opponent, our adversary, in a domain that they want as much as this one to be the center of influence? I would argue that China's not trying to burn down the world. They just want to be in the middle of it. And I would argue the same applies to them in space. And so as you move into your active duty opportunities, and you think about the way China is moving out in the Pacific, I would challenge you to also consider thinking about how they're moving out in space.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I think we have time for one audience question before the panel ends. So please just raise your hand. I'll come up with the microphone.
So I got to say, that's got me pretty jazzed up. I'm like, hey, am I in the wrong service? No. So, Captain Yarbrough, yeah. We'll see. Captain Yarborough, I instruct electrical and computer engineering. Previously, I was with Joint Special Operations Command doing offensive cyber. And ma'am, this question's primarily for you, but I'm going to echo a question lots of cadets have asked me. Where does cyber fit into the Space Force?
So like electricity and HVAC, cyber is our soft underbelly, and I cannot do the job without it. So one of the key things you'll notice when we stood the Space Force up, you can go ahead and sit down if you want, you keep saying. One of the key focuses when we decided who was coming and what missions would be in the Space Force, we brought the things that we considered operations that we needed to absolutely do the job, and cyber is one of those. So we have led the Department of the Air Force with mission system defense. We have mission defense teams. So you have cyber operators sitting on ops floors with space operators and with apps and tools defending the mission systems as we sit here today. And it continues to grow. We have Delta 6, that is their mission, is to do cyber defense of our space system. So it's critical. We have to do it. So we are building our own mission system defense. The natural question comes, when do we enter the rest of the cyber mission force? Do we build an ability not only to exploit the enemy's space capabilities through cyber? Do we get to something that is an attack capability? Those are things we're talking about for the future as we build the force. Who better to exploit and attack the enemy's space cyber connected capabilities than space guardians? But we got to grow into that. But today we have cyber operators every day defending our key cyber terrain because we cannot do the job without it. I can bang on the computer all day. If I don't have the fiber connection to the antenna up to the satellite to be able to talk to it and send commands, I've got nothing. We have tried to create the resiliency of satellite talking to satellite, so think crosslinks and other ways to build that resiliency in all of our architectures. But fundamentally, somewhere the operator has to be able to interact with the constellation to put those things in, and that's done via cyber. So it's absolutely critical in our soft underbelly and what we worry about every day. At least I do as the COO. Yes, sir.
I think from a cyber or Space Command perspective, we work closely with Cyber Command, but we're actually at General Dickinson's request, part of my organization, we're developing requirements for electronic warfare and offensive cyber operations. Yesterday, instead of being able to be here and hear some of the great talks that we're having, I had to spend about 4.5 hours with some staffers from the House Armed Services Committee, and I had to explain to them there's 3 ways that you can impact either our or the adversary's capabilities, right? You can do something on orbit, you can do something to the ground segment, and that can be either on the user equipment side or on the control side, or there's that link in between the two. And all 3 of those can be attacked either kinetically or non-kinetically. So cyber, both offensive and defensive, at least from General Dickinson's foxhole, is critically important. And we look at how we can team both with the services and with Cybercom on how to leverage that offensively and defensively.
So one last thing I would say too from Cyber Command, we've just stood up 3 of our service components, one at Indo-PACOM, one at CENTCOM, and one at U.S. Forces Korea. The next one of the folks we're talking to is Cyber Command. Do we have a Space Force service component to Cyber Command? And you will hear General Dickinson and many talk about there's a triad between SOF, space, and cyber, and how do those 3 work together in some of this competition phase left of physical war breaking out in some of these O plans. So how do we make those connections between those? And so Cyber Command will be the first functional component, or functional COCOM, if you will, that we will look to build a Space Force service component to. And how will that then work with the CMT, the Cyber Mission Team, Force Presentation, and the Cyber Mission Force, and who will be the Cyber Mission Force in the future that supports U.S. Space Command? So that's all being discussed, but again, I expect that to continue to grow out here in the next 2 to 3 years to robust out.
Well, General Burt, Chief Simmons, Mr. Soley, thank you so much for taking your time to come speak with us today. Okay, this will conclude our session. Cadets, please check in for the session using the QR code on the poster. Thank you, everyone.